Hi everyone, it's Sam and the beautiful Mr. Kipling. We've been asked today if we wouldn't mind doing a video on phobias and panic attacks, because this is something that comes up quite often. It often comes up in my clinic as well. This evening we're going to look at phobias and panic attacks, because often if we are phobic about something, we might have a panic attack afterwards. So we're going to talk about both of those tonight. Now, phobias, it is said that we are born with two natural fears. One is loud noises and the other is falling. So if you look at a fear of heights, I think that could be quite natural, because have you ever been at the side of a cliff and think, oh, I'm going to fall, I'm going to fall? It's really scary, really scary. So that is one of our natural fears. But also, if you see a child who's bumbling along with a balloon at the side like this, and then suddenly pop it goes, often that can frighten a child half to death, and they can actually become quite phobic even of balloons, so they don't want to go to parties. So when we look at phobias, there are many different reasons why. In my experience, and I do say my experience, this may not be the experience of all therapists, but in my experience, when people come into clinic with phobias, it's often related to death. So for instance, if they have a fear of water, they fear drowning. If they have a fear of spiders, they fear that the spider will bite them and that they will get some kind of allergic reaction. Same with wasps or bees. I've heard of cases where people have been actually frightened of baked beans. And one of the reasons they've been frightened of baked beans is when they were young, this is a true case by the way, when they were young, they stuck a baked bean up their nose. And unfortunately, they couldn't then breathe properly, or they thought they couldn't breathe because they didn't actually remember to breathe through the mouth. And so that set up the fear of baked beans. So much so, it was so crippling that they wouldn't go down the aisle that had the baked beans in one of the supermarkets. So, although they may seem ridiculous to other people, and you might have just had a bit of a giggle over that, it's quite serious to some people. And it can be so bad, it's life-changing, where they will literally avoid certain aisles in the supermarket. The other one that I've come across quite a lot is when somebody gets into a theatre or a cinema, it's quite dark, it's quite noisy, and they end up in the middle part of the cinema, so they're not on the end seats, and therefore there tends to be a feeling of being trapped, and I can't get out, and oh my goodness, what if I feel poorly, or I feel faint, I need to get out. And then the fear starts to build. Now, interestingly, with phobias, it starts off with a negative thought. So a negative thought goes in. This then builds to something that's quite big. And although it might seem very insignificant to others, to the person suffering it, it is huge. And there is a fear. There's a fear of something happening to them, or a fear of something happening to their loved ones. It is irrational, but it is there and it needs to be worked on. This can then end up in a situation where we end up with a panic attack. Now, panic attacks always start with a fearful thought. So it's a negative thought. It's something that's gone in, you've thought about it, and suddenly you are scared. Now, our body has a natural reaction to fear. So if the thought has gone in that's frightening, the body then begins to react if the thought isn't put right quickly. The body then starts, the adrenaline kicks off, all the different chemicals in the body kick off, and it's ready to run as fast as possible anywhere but away from the problem that's there. The problem with panic attacks, they appear to come from nowhere. And this is what frightens people the most. But there's always a source. It's just finding what that source is, going back to it and understanding where that source has come from. The source of the panic can often start in childhood. So for instance, you might have a child who's 11 or 12 months old, crawled into the garden, hasn't got any pockets, but has seen half a dozen spiders and a couple of worms, and chucks them down his nappy because he's got nowhere else to put them. Thinks, I know, I'll show those to Mum, so crawls back into the house. Mum then changes the nappy. As she opens the nappy, it's her reaction to seeing the spiders that is actually what the baby picks up on. Because the baby's thrilled. He's got no fear at all of the spiders. But Mum's overreaction to the fear of, my goodness, what's in my child's nappy? And even if she screams or runs, what can then happen is the baby automatically puts the fear upon the animal rather than putting the fear upon mum. Because mum is the one that mirrors what we need to do in life or how we should react in life. So that's very much how a phobia when we're young starts. And then we can end up with the problem of you'll say to somebody when they're sort of 15, 16, well, how do you think that started? Oh, I don't know, I've got no idea. It just started. But they all start from somewhere, and it is trying to find out where it starts. You could, for instance, find somebody who's frightened of water, and that's quite a natural thing to be frightened of because they may have a fear of drowning. Someone, when they were younger, may have had their head put under the water, or they may have been in the sea and a huge wave came over and frightened them. So some of these fears it's normal to have them, but it's not normal if you're constantly having panic attacks and you're not able to face going out somewhere, and it's literally stopping you doing what you want to do. For instance, going to the cinema. Loads of people like going to the cinema, but if they can't see the exits, they panic. That brings on a panic attack. So then the thought is, oh my goodness, I'm having a panic attack. It must be to do with being in the dark, or it must be to do with being in the cinema. So they will avoid the cinema altogether. It wouldn't be unusual to be afraid after a car accident, for instance. If you go down a road and you have a nasty accident and it's a road that you travel many times, it's not unusual for people to put the fear upon the area which they had the accident rather than the accident itself. And sometimes they'll avoid the area for years, literally. But you have to have the same two cars at the same moment in time to have the same accident. So it's unlikely that it would ever happen again. But the irrational side of our brain says it will happen again, and then they become quite phobic and worried. Now, on a situation like that, okay, they might be going miles out of their way to go through somewhere that they could go through quickly, but it's not actually stopping them from doing anything. But it's the panic that's the interesting part. Nowadays, we panic over things that we feel afterwards, oh my goodness, that was irrational. But it's the thoughts that need challenging. At the time the panic is coming in, they need to be challenged and they need to be faced. And that is actually quite a difficult thing to do. For really big phobias and panic attacks, it's always worth popping along to the doctor for them to refer you through to a counsellor. CBT is particularly good for phobias because it helps you face all those fears that are happening in the moment at that time, and it challenges a lot of the thought patterns. So it's really valuable. So if you do find that it's a lot bigger than you are and it is stopping you do things every single day, then pop along to your doctor, or you can privately refer yourself. In my experience, facing what we're frightened of helps so much. Even if it seems as if it's irrational to other people, it's not irrational to you. If it is scaring you so much that you're stopping things you're doing in your life, then just if you can, face it. One of the other fears that I come across an awful lot is the fear of fear. So people are actually frightened of being frightened. And what can happen, particularly in a panic attack, is we have a panic attack and then we don't know where it's come from. So it's absolutely frightened you to death, completely frightened you to death. So the next thing is you think, I'm going to have another panic attack. Oh my God, I'm really scared. What if I have another one? So then what it tends to bring on, unfortunately, is another panic attack because you become frightened of being frightened. And this can end up in a nasty catch-22 situation. So the situation that scared you in the first place, so it might be, I don't know, a horror movie or something someone said or a big dog racing at you barking, that has actually gone. That situation has long gone. But the effects of the panic stay with us. And this can be challenged very easily by first recognising that you're frightened of being frightened. Because just by recognising what's bringing on the fear can help us first calm down, and secondly, okay, how do I deal with that? And again, it's worth talking to other people around that, because you'd be surprised how many people feel exactly the same way. I think, unfortunately, when we feel panicky, we often feel a loss of control. We feel that we are going to lose our minds, or we're going to just run and never come back. And that is really, really, really scary. This may seem quite bizarre to some people, but one of the things that I found really, really useful is when somebody is panicky, and sometimes when they come into clinic, they are quite panic stricken. It's very difficult to talk about your deep emotions, and when those emotions come up, they can scare you. So, when it's quite obvious that somebody is getting anxious and then beginning to become very panicky and going hot and cold and getting scared, I ask them to just sit with it just for a minute. Don't run, don't pretend it's not happening, don't try to avoid it, but just literally sit for a moment in the fear. And then, strangely, what happens is it disappears. Because what they then realise is it's not going to hurt them, it's not going to cause them any worries, it's not going to kill them, and they're certainly not going to go mad. And that relaxes them so much more. Acknowledging that we're frightened is the most important part of combating, I feel, panic attacks. Because if we don't acknowledge what we're frightened of, we can't deal with it. And trying to pretend that we don't get frightened is another problem. Because I think there's also a feeling of weakness if we have to acknowledge that, do you know what, that absolutely scares me to death. And so if you can acknowledge your fears, it is so much easier to bear. And as I say, we all suffer from fears. Even those that are of us who are trained and know why these things happen still get frightened. Another good thing is distraction. If you're getting panicky, don't sit and just overthink things over and over and over again. Once you've sat in that panic and calmed down, go and do something else. Distract yourself so that your mind is almost distracted into thinking, oh, okay, we've got to do something else now. It doesn't get into this nasty habit of thinking it over and thinking it over. Because what you'll find is, if you overthink it, you end up going back into a panic state, which then unfortunately brings on the panic attack again. It's not unusual for people to report that they've had up to 10 panic attacks a day, and that is because they're waiting for the next one to come. So that anticipation brings on yet more panic, which then develops into another panic attack, and that's an awful cycle to get into. So if you feel as if you're really panicked, don't run away, just sit in it for a moment. Once you're slightly calmer, go off and do something else. I don't know, read a book, talk to someone. That's always quite good. Sometimes people find it very helpful if they can just go and find someone else in the house, or if they're alone, that they phone someone, or they could read a book. Something to just try and distract their mind. It is difficult when you are in a very anxious state. I'm not going to say to you it's not. However, it is, you are able to do it, and each time you do it, it will get easier and easier. By getting to the root, it'll help you and calm you down. Now, what I can't promise you is that actually you can find that root, because no one can promise that, especially if it started in your younger years, because you simply won't remember. And, you know, as I said before, with mum running across the room screaming away from a spider, she won't remember doing it, therefore is not able to tell you, well, actually, it might have been me being frightened that caused you to be frightened. But just rest assured that there will be some kind of starting point. We're not born scared to death, so something has created that. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye bye.